The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the Veterans Affairs office in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and bureaucracy, a mix that clung to the faded linoleum floors and chipped beige walls. It was a Tuesday morning in 2012, and the waiting area was half mint. Veterans, young and old, some in worn ball caps with unit patches, others in ill-fitting suits, all navigating the labyrinth of paperwork that promised benefits for their service. At the counter stood Colonel James Jim Callahan, 78 years old, his frame stooped but unyielding, like an oak weathered by decades of storms. His suit, a navy pinstripe tailored in the 70s, when his chest was broader and his stride surer, hung loosely on his wiry frame. Pinned to his lapel were medals that gleamed faintly under the harsh light, a bronze star, a silver star, a purple heart, each a silent testament to battles fought in jungles and deserts half a world away. His gnarled hands, knuckles swollen from arthritis, clutched a manila folder stuffed with documents chronicling 38 years of service to the United States. Jim Callahan hadn't come to beg. He wasn't the type. He'd led men through the hell of Vietnam and Desert Storm, made split-second decisions that saved lives, and carried the weight of those who didn't make it home. All he wanted was an answer. Why had his pension, hard-earned through blood and sacrifice, been frozen for 4 months? Letters he'd sent to the VA had vanished into a void, and the automated phone system seemed a maddening loop of menus and hold music offered no clarity. Today, he'd made the 12-block trek from his modest apartment, leaning heavily on a cane carved from cedar, a gift from a grateful sergeant he'd pulled from a burning Humvee in '91. The walk had left him winded, but his eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room with the vigilance of a man who'd never left the battlefield. Behind the counter, Ethan Parker, a 23-year-old clerk with a slicked-back undercut and a smartwatch that buzzed with every text, barely glanced up from his computer. His name tag, slightly crooked, gleamed under the lights. Ethan was new, barely 6 months into the job and already jaded by the endless stream of veterans and their complaints. To him, they were just files to process, numbers to clear before lunch. He flipped through Callahan's folder with a practiced indifference, his fingers pausing only to tap a quick reply to a group chat. The other clerks, 3 women and a man, all in their 20s, huddled nearby, stifling giggles over a meme Ethan had shared earlier. The office had a rhythm: process, deflect, move on. Callahan, with his faded medals and trembling hands, was just another interruption. "Still kicking, huh?" Ethan said, his voice loud enough to carry across the waiting area. He leaned back in his swivel chair, a smirk curling his lips. "Thought old relics like you belonged in the Smithsonian." The words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. A ripple of laughter spread through the office. One clerk, a woman with a high ponytail and a name tag reading Kayla, snorted behind her monitor. "And a guy named Ryan," coughed to cover a chuckle. The veterans in the waiting area shifted uncomfortably, some staring at the floor, others glaring at Ethan but saying nothing. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves absorbed the insult. Callahan didn't flinch. His face, lined like a roadmap of grief and grit, remained impassive. Decades of command had taught him the power of silence, the kind that forces others to confront their own words. His blue eyes, still piercing despite the years, locked onto Ethan for a moment. Not with anger, but with something deeper, something that made Ethan's smirk falter. Callahan set the pension denial form, a single sheet stamped with bureaucratic red ink, on the counter with deliberate care. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of keeping his body upright. He adjusted his suit jacket, the metals clinking softly, and turned toward the exit. His cane tapped a steady rhythm on the linoleum, each step a defiance of the pain radiating from his knees. The glass doors swung shut behind him, leaving a void in the room. In the corner of the waiting area, Margaret Maggie Thompson, 76, sat clutching a worn purse, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She'd seen it all unfold: the clerk's cruel jab, the stifled laughs, the colonel's quiet dignity. Maggie wasn't just any bystander. Her late husband, Sergeant David Thompson, had served under Callahan in Vietnam, one of the few who'd come home from a brutal ambush in '68. David had spoken of Callahan with reverence, calling him the kind of leader who'd walk through fire for his men. Maggie's eyes narrowed as she watched Ethan lean back, already joking with Kayla about old-timers and their war stories. Her fingers tightened around her phone, a simple flip model she'd carried for years. She typed a brief message, her hands steady despite her age. Colonel Callahan disrespected at VA office, downtown Nashville. Today, the recipient was no ordinary contact, General Robert Bob Larson, a 3-star general who owed his life to Callahan's courage in a dusty Iraqi village years ago. Outside, Callahan eased himself onto a concrete bench, the October chill seeping through his thin jacket. He pulled a faded photograph from his breast pocket, its edges worn from years of handling. The image showed his platoon in Vietnam, 1979. Young men grinning under the weight of their gear, arms slung around each other's shoulders. 5 never made it back. Their names, Tommy Hayes, Marcus Lee, Juan Rivera, Eddie Walsh, and Sam Carter, were etched in his memory, as vivid as the day he'd lost them. He ran a callous thumb over their faces, his breath catching as the wind stung his eyes. The pension wasn't just money. It was heat for his apartment, medicine for his heart, a lifeline to honor the men who'd trusted him. He sat there, alone, the weight of his service heavier than ever. Inside, Ethan was still chuckling, oblivious to the storm he'd set in motion. "These guys, man," he said to Ryan, scrolling through Callahan's digital file. "Says here he led some big deal mission in Kuwait. Yeah, right. Probably made it all up." Ryan nodded, smirking. "Bet he can't even remember where he parked his car." They didn't notice Maggie, her face set in quiet fury, slipping her phone back into her purse. They didn't see the spark she'd ignited, one that would soon burn through their small, careless world. The Nashville sky was bruised with storm clouds as 3 black SUVs roared into the Veterans Affairs office parking lot, their tires screeching against the asphalt with military precision. Pedestrians froze mid-step, their eyes drawn to the vehicle's tinted windows and government plates. Inside the VA office, the hum of routine typing, murmured complaints. The faint crackle of a radio stuttered to a halt. Clerks peered through the glass doors, their coffee cups forgotten as the lead SUV's door swung open. General William Bill Hargrove, 62, stepped out, his 3 silver stars glinting on his immaculate dress uniform. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the kind that had silenced war rooms and steadied soldiers under fire. 6 officers flanked him, their boots hitting the pavement in unison, a phalanx of purpose cutting through the autumn chill. The air crackled with anticipation, as if the world itself held its breath. Inside, Ethan Parker's smirk had long faded. He sat rigid at his desk, his smartwatch silent for once, as the glass doors burst open. Hargrove didn't pause at the security desk, didn't glance at the "please sign in" clipboard. His presence filled the room like a thunderclap, his voice low but sharp enough to cut steel. Who disrespected Colonel Callahan? The question hung in the air, heavy as a guillotine. Keyboards fell silent. Kayla's ponytail bobbed as she ducked behind her monitor. Ryan's cough caught in his throat. Even the veterans in the waiting area, hardened by their own battles, sat straighter, sensing the weight of what was unfolding. Ethan's face drained of color, his hands fumbling over a pen that rolled off the desk and clattered to the floor. Hargrove's eyes swept the room, missing nothing. He was no stranger to Colonel James Callahan. In 1991, during a night ambush in Kuwait, Callahan had dragged a wounded Hargrove, then a young captain, 2 miles through a sandstorm, enemy rows kicking up dust around them. Callahan had refused to leave until every man in his unit was safe, even as blood soaked through his own torn uniform. That debt, etched into Hargrove's soul, had brought him here today. Maggie Thompson's text had been brief, but it was enough. Callahan, the man who taught him what leadership meant, had been humiliated, and Hargrove would not stand for it. The office manager, a woman in her 40s named Linda Grayson, emerged from her office, smoothing her blazer with nervous hands. "General, sir, perhaps we could discuss this privately?" Her voice wavered, caught between protocol and panic. Hargrove's gaze pinned her in place. "Private?" he said, his tone slicing through her words. There was nothing private about the insult dealt to Colonel Callahan, so there will be nothing private about the consequences. He gestured toward the glass doors, where Callahan now stood escorted by two of Hargrove's officers. The colonel's posture was rigid, his cane gripped tightly, his face a mix of confusion and quiet resolve. The medals on his chest caught the light, their faded surfaces gleaming with a defiance that no clerk's mockery could dim. Hargrove's voice dropped, but its intensity burned brighter. "That man," he said, pointing to Callahan, "carried me through hell when I was bleeding out in the desert. He saved my life and the lives of 12 others, refusing evacuation until every soldier under his command was accounted for. He's worn this country's uniform for 38 years, through wars you can't even pronounce." His eyes locked onto Ethan, whose nervous swallow betrayed him. "And you thought it was your place to call him a relic?" The room was a tomb, the silence so thick it seemed to choke the air. Ethan shrank in his chair, his bravado gone, his eyes fixed on the floor as if it might swallow him whole. Maggie Thompson, still seated in the corner, allowed herself a faint smile. Her husband, David, had told her stories of Callahan's courage. How he'd held their platoon together when a Viet Cong ambush tore through their ranks. How he had carried a dying private 3 miles to a medevac chopper, whispering promises of home even as the boy's life slipped away. Maggie had carried those stories like a torch, and now, watching Hargrove dismantle the room's complacency, she felt David's pride burning in her chest. This was justice, not just for Callahan, but for every veteran who'd been dismissed, forgotten, or mocked. Hargrove turned to the doors, striding out to meet Callahan. The officers parted, and the general extended a hand, not as a superior, but as a brother in arms. "Colonel," he said, his voice softer now, "I apologize for what happened here. This is not the America you fought for." Callan's eyes met his, and for a moment the weight of decades, war, loss, and quiet endurance passed between them. "No need, General," Callan said, his voice steadied despite the tremor in his hands. "I've faced worse than a kid with a big mouth, but—" His eyes betrayed a flicker of pain, the kind that comes from being discarded by the system you swore to protect. The confrontation sparked a fire that spread faster than anyone could have predicted. By noon, news vans Arkansased outside the VA office, their cameras trained on Hargrove and Callahan as they spoke at an impromptu press conference. Hargrove's words were unrelenting. Colonel Callahan was denied not just his pension, but his dignity. "This is a betrayal of every man and woman who served this nation." He announced a sweeping review of all denied or delayed veteran benefits, effective immediately. The crowd, veterans, families, and passers-by, stood in stunned silence, some wiping tears as Callahan stood tall, his cane grounded like a flagpole. Behind the scenes, the VA office scrambled. Linda Grayson, her face pale, processed Callahan's paperwork with trembling hands. By evening, his pension was reinstated, back payments included, along with a formal apology signed by the regional director. But Callahan's influence didn't end there. At his insistence, Ethan wasn't fired. Instead, the colonel requested he be reassigned to a veteran outreach program coupled with mandatory sensitivity training. "Punishment doesn't teach," Callahan told Hargrove privately. "Responsibility does." Ethan, shaken to his core, nodded silently, his earlier arrogance replaced by something resembling shame. That night, social media erupted. A shaky cell phone video of Hargrove's entrance went viral, shared by veterans groups with hashtags like "Honor Our Heroes" and "Justice for Callahan." Comments poured in, stories of similar disrespect fueling a national outcry. By morning, Ethan's social media accounts were private, flooded with messages from strangers who'd seen the video. But it was Callahan's quiet act of mercy that hit hardest. Veterans shared stories of his leadership, how he'd carried wounded men to safety, how he'd written letters to their families long after the wars ended. One post from a Marine who'd served under him read, "He never left us behind. Why did we leave him?" Callahan returned home to his small apartment where a single lamp cast shadows over his medals, polished every Sunday like a ritual. He sat by the window, the Nashville skyline glittering in the distance, and pulled out the photograph of his platoon. Their faces, Tommy, Marcus, Juan, Eddie, Sam, stared back, forever young. A single tear traced his weathered cheek, not for himself, but for them, for the promise he'd kept to never give up even when the country he loved seemed to turn its outside. The storm clouds broke and rain began to fall, as if the heavens themselves wept for the man who stood unbroken. The Nashville dawn broke with a golden haze, the kind that made the city's skyline shimmer like a promise kept. A week had passed since General William Hargrove's thunderous arrival at the Veterans Affairs office, and the ripple effects of Colonel James Callahan's stand were still spreading, like a stone dropped in a still pond. The story had become a wildfire, fueled by viral videos and heartfelt posts from veterans across the country. Honor Callahan trended on every platform, a rallying cry for those who'd served and those who loved them. But for Callahan, the world remained quiet, centered in his small apartment where he rose at 5 a.m., as always, to polish his medals with a cloth worn thin from years of devotion. The Bronze Star, Silver Star, and Purple Heart gleamed under his careful hands, each a memory of men he'd led, men he'd lost, men he'd never stopped honoring. Today was different, though he didn't know it yet. The city had planned something extraordinary. Outside the VA office, a crowd gathered under a crisp October sky. Veterans in faded uniforms, families clutching photos of loved ones lost, and ordinary Nashvillians drawn by the story of a man who'd faced disrespect and emerged unbroken. A makeshift stage stood in the parking lot, draped in red, white, and blue bunting, flanked by an honor guard of local Marines, their faces carved with reverence. At the center, a bronze plaque gleamed, its inscription simple yet profound. For Colonel James Callahan, who never asked for honor, but earned it every day. The mayor, a wiry woman named Clara Bennett, adjusted her notes at the podium, her hands trembling, not from nerves, but from the weight of the moment. She'd heard the stories, Callahan's courage in Vietnam, his mercy toward Ethan Parker, his quiet refusal to let bitterness win. This ceremony wasn't just for him, it was for every veteran who'd been forgotten. Callahan arrived unannounced, escorted by Maggie Thompson, who'd insisted he let her drive. He stepped out of her old Buick, his cane tapping the asphalt, his suit pressed but still loose on his frame. The crowd parted as he approached, a sea of faces, young and old, scarred and whole, watching him with something akin to awe. A young Marine, no older than 20, snapped a salute, his eyes glistening. Callahan returned it, his hands steady despite the ache in his joints. He hadn't wanted this attention, had never been his goal, but Maggie's gentle nudge and the memory of his platoon's faces pushed him forward. The crowd's silence was deafening, broken only by the rustle of flags in the breeze. Mayor Bennett's voice cracked as she spoke. "Colonel Callahan," she began, "you've reminded us what sacrifice means, what honor demands. You fought for this country, and when it failed you, you fought for its soul." She gestured to the plaque, her voice rising. "This is our promise to you and to every veteran. We will do better." The crowd erupted in applause, some cheering, others weeping openly. A Vietnam vet in a wheelchair, his cap embroidered with Caisson 68, gripped his daughter's hand, tears streaming down his weathered face. A young mother, whose husband never returned from Afghanistan, clutched a folded flag to her chest, her sobs mingling with the crowd's roar. Callahan stood at attention, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but a tremor in his jaw betrayed the emotion he fought to contain. The ceremony wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. Veterans organizations flooded the mayor's office with calls demanding reforms. The review General Hargrove had ordered uncovered 4,127 cases of wrongly denied or delayed benefits nationwide, each one a life like Callahan's, hanging by a thread. By week's end, Congress announced a bipartisan inquiry into the VA system, with Hargrove testifying before a packed chamber. His words echoed Callahan's quiet strength. "We cannot repay these men and women, but we can stop betraying them." Back in Nashville, the VA office implemented mandatory training, not just for Ethan, but for every employee. Ethan himself, transformed by his reassignment to the Veteran Outreach Program, spent his days delivering meals to elderly vets, listening to their stories with a humility he'd never known. At night, he lay awake, haunted by Callahan's piercing gaze, determined to become more than the kid who'd mocked a hero. Callahan, meanwhile, returned to his routine, baking oatmeal cookies for recruits at the nearby Fort Campbell, attending memorial services for veterans with no family left. But something had shifted. When he walked into the VA office for a follow-up, the room stilled. Clerk stood, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Linda Grayson, the manager who'd failed to intervene, now greeted him by name, her eyes meeting his with genuine remorse. Word of his story had spread beyond Nashville, touching hearts in small towns and big cities alike. A high school in Memphis named its gym after him. A veterans group in Texas sent him a handmade quilt, each patch embroidered with a name from his old platoon: Tommy, Marcus, Juan, Eddie, Sam. Callahan hung it on his wall, a tapestry of memory that warmed his sparse apartment. As Veterans Day approached, the city invited Callahan to raise the flag at Bicentennial Capitol Mall State Park. He arrived at dawn, the air crisp, the park silent except for the soft hum of a distant bugle. His hands, gnarled but strong, gripped the rope, pulling the stars and stripes skyward with a reverence that silenced the crowd. As the flag caught the wind, a formation of F-16S roared overhead in a missing man formation, a tribute Hargrove had arranged for the men in Callahan's faded photograph. The colonel's eyes followed the jets, his face unyielding, but a single tear escaped, carving a path down his cheek. It wasn't for himself, it never was. It was for Tommy, who'd died in his arms, for Marcus, who'd laughed through the fear, for Juan, Eddie, and Sam, whose faces lived in his dreams, for the promise he kept, even when the world forgot. But the story didn't end there. As Callahan stepped back, a young boy, no more than 10, wearing a too-big army cap, tugged at his sleeve. "Sir," he whispered, "my dad says you're a hero. Will you tell me about your friends?" Callahan knelt, ignoring the pain in his knees, and looked into the boy's wide eyes. "They were the real heroes," he said, his voice soft but steady. "And they'd want you to keep asking, keep learning." The boy nodded, clutching a notebook where he'd scribbled names from the plaque. Behind him, the crowd watched, some recording the moment, others wiping their eyes. Maggie Thompson, standing nearby, smiled through her own tears, knowing David would have been proud. The ceremony ended, but the questions lingered. Would the reforms hold? Would the nation remember men like Callahan when the headlines faded? And what of Ethan, whose journey was just beginning? Could he carry the weight of his mistake into a life of service? As Callahan walked away, his cane tapping a steady rhythm, the crowd parted once more. A faint smile touched his lips, not for the honors or the applause, but for the boy's question, for the hope it carried. The flag above waved against a restless sky, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled, a reminder that some battles never end and some heroes never stop fighting.